Champagne glasses clinked as Eleanor Kensington loudly declared that her son's new in-laws looked like they had crawled out of a thrift store dumpster. She smirked, surrounded by her country club friends, relishing the humiliation of the bride's weeping parents. But Eleanor's cruel laughter died in her throat when a fleet of midnight blue Rolls-Royces breached the estate gates. Out stepped a man whose mere presence commanded heads of state, and he was walking straight toward the people she just mocked. Chloe Harper never cared about money. Raised in a modest aluminum-sided house in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, she was taught that character, loyalty, and hard work were the only currencies that truly mattered. Her father, Thomas, was a retired mechanic who walked with a pronounced limp, a souvenir from a vague incident during his military service in the late 80s that he never spoke of. Her mother, Martha, spent her days running a small, struggling community bakery that smelled perpetually of cinnamon and exhaust from the street outside. They were simple, fiercely loving people who had saved every penny to send their only daughter to the Rhode Island School of Design. It was there in the meticulous and quiet world of fine art restoration that Chloe found her calling. And it was 5 years later, while meticulously repairing a 19th-century maritime oil painting at a high-end Boston gallery, that she met Preston Kensington. Preston was the kind of man who looked as though he had been genetically engineered to wear a tailored Tom Ford suit. He was the vice president of acquisitions at Kensington Rothschild Holdings, his father's sprawling private equity firm. When he walked into the gallery, flashing a perfectly whitened smile and carrying an aura of expensive cologne and generational entitlement, Chloe was initially immune to his charm. But Preston was relentless. He courted her with the aggressive, overwhelming strategy of a corporate takeover. He sent Orchid's chartered helicopters to Martha's vineyard for lunch and spoke of her talent with a reverence that made Chloe feel seen. For the first year, it felt like a modern-day fairy tale. But as the wedding planning began, the gilded edges of Preston's world began to peel, revealing the cold, unforgiving steel beneath. The true nightmare began the night Chloe introduced her parents to Preston's family. The Kensingtons resided in a sprawling historic estate in Lexington, Massachusetts, a fortress of manicured ivy, towering oak trees, and a driveway long enough to require its own zip code. Eleanor Kensington Preston's mother was a woman entirely composed of sharp angles, platinum blonde hair sprayed into absolute submission, and a wardrobe consisting entirely of neutral-toned Chanel. Richard Preston's father, Forshers, was a formidable man who treated every conversation like a hostile negotiation. When Thomas and Martha Harper arrived at the Kensington estate in their 10-year-old Honda Civic, the disparity was suffocating. Thomas had worn his best suit, a charcoal two-piece he had purchased off the rack at a Macy's a decade ago. Martha wore a floral dress she had proudly sewn herself. Eleanor opened the mahogany double doors, her eyes instantly dropping to Martha's scuffed orthopedic heels, before sweeping up to Thomas's slightly frayed collar. The smile that touched Eleanor's face was tighter than a snare drum. "Oh," Eleanor had breathed, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension. "You must be the Harpers. We were wondering if your vehicle had gotten lost on the turnpike. Do come in. I'll have the housekeeper put some newspaper down in the foyer. It's been raining and we simply cannot have the Persian rugs ruined." Chloe had flinched, looking to Preston for backup, but Preston was already halfway down the hall, checking his Rolex. "Come on, Mom, don't keep them at the door," he called over his shoulder, entirely oblivious or willfully ignorant of the insult. Throughout the agonizing three-course dinner, the Kensingtons treated Chloe's parents not as prospective family, but as an unfortunate anthropological exhibit. Richard Kensington aggressively questioned Thomas about his financial portfolio, laughing out loud when Thomas admitted he mostly relied on his pension and the bakery's modest profits. "Fascinating," Richard had sneered, swirling a glass of 50-year-old Macallan. "I suppose someone has to occupy the bottom rungs of the economic ladder, keeps the ecosystem balanced." But it was the wedding planning where the Kensingtons truly weaponized their wealth. Because Richard and Eleanor insisted on a sprawling 300-guest spectacle at Rosecliff, an impossibly opulent Gilded Age mansion in Newport, they seized complete control of the event. They dismissed Chloe's choices at every turn. When Chloe suggested her mother bake the wedding cake, Eleanor had actually choked on her sparkling water in a fit of theatrical laughter, insisting they were flying in a pastry chef from Paris. Worse still was the financial manipulation. While the Kensingtons were eager to pay for the venue and the extravagant floral arrangements to show off to their elite friends, they spitefully handed Thomas Harper an itemized bill for the bride's traditional familial obligations, a staggering $40,000 invoice for Chloe's custom gown, the bridesmaids' luncheons, and a series of absurd administrative wedding fees. Thomas, a man of profound pride, had looked at the piece of paper, his hands trembling slightly. He had quietly taken out a second mortgage on his small home, rather than let the Kensingtons know he couldn't afford it. Chloe only found out weeks later, when she saw the loan documents on the kitchen table. She had wept and begged him to cancel the wedding to elope, but Thomas had held her face in his calloused hands. "You love him, Chloe," Thomas had said, his voice steady, masking the deep exhaustion in his eyes. "And you deserve a beautiful day. Your mother and I will not let these people make you feel small. We survive. That's what we do." But Chloe was beginning to realize that survival in the Kensington world meant enduring 1,000 tiny cuts. As the wedding week arrived, the divide grew from a quiet crack into a gaping, inescapable chasm, and Chloe found herself trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Beacon Hill Club, an exclusive, members-only establishment, where the initiation fee alone cost more than the Harpers' entire house. The dining room was a spectacular display of mahogany crystal chandeliers and oil portraits of severe-looking men who had probably monopolized railroads in the 1800s. Chloe felt like she was marching to an execution rather than her pre-wedding celebration. She wore a stunning ivory silk dress, but it felt heavy, restrictive. Beside her, Preston was glowing entirely in his element as he shook hands with state senators, venture capitalists, and old money heirs that his parents had invited. The event was supposed to be a gathering of close family to celebrate the couple, but Eleanor had turned it into a networking gala for Kensington Rothschild Holdings. When it was time to be seated, Chloe looked at the embossed seating chart by the entrance and felt the blood drain from her face. The head table was an extravagant affair, positioned in the center of the room, adorned with cascading white orchids. Seated there were Richard and Eleanor Preston, two of Richard's most prominent investors and a local congressman. Chloe's parents were not at the head table. Panic rising in her chest, Chloe scanned the room. She found Thomas and Martha seated at table 14. It was the very last table in the back corner, wedged tightly next to the swinging kitchen doors. Every time a waiter burst through with a tray, the harsh, fluorescent light of the kitchen bled over Thomas and Martha. They were seated with three of Preston's younger, rowdy fraternity brothers and the Kensingtons' eccentric, heavily drinking great-aunt, who was already asleep in her soup. "Preston," Chloe hissed, grabbing his forearm as he tried to glide past her with a glass of champagne. "Look at where your mother put my parents. They're next to the kitchen. They're the parents of the bride." Preston sighed, offering a patronizing smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Chloe, babe, don't make a scene. My dad has investors here tonight. We need the front tables for the VIPs. Your parents don't know anyone anyway. They're probably more comfortable back there where there's less pressure to mingle." "Less pressure," Chloe's voice cracked. "They're treated like an afterthought. I'm moving them." "You absolutely will not." Eleanor's voice cut through the air like a frozen blade. She materialized behind Chloe, smelling of expensive gin and malice. "The seating chart is fixed. If your parents wanted prime real estate, perhaps they should have contributed more than a fraction to the overall budget. Now smile, Chloe. You look positively ungrateful." Chloe's vision blurred with tears of pure rage. She looked back at table 14. Thomas was sitting completely upright, his dignified posture refusing to yield to the indignity of the location. He was gently wiping a spill from the table that one of the fraternity brothers had caused, while Martha looked down at her lap, her face flushed with humiliation. The evening only devolved from there. When it was time for the speeches, Richard Kensington stood up, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal flute. He spoke for 20 minutes about Preston's accomplishments, the Kensington legacy, and the upcoming merger his company was orchestrating. He mentioned Chloe exactly once, referring to her as Preston's charming little art project. Then Eleanor took the microphone. She swayed slightly, her eyes locking onto the back corner of the room. "We are just so thrilled," Eleanor announced into the microphone, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "So thrilled to welcome Chloe into our family. It is always a beautiful thing when we can elevate someone, when we can bring a girl from such a quaint, simple, humble background and show her how the world truly operates." Titters of laughter rippled through the wealthy crowd. Chloe felt physically ill. "Of course," Eleanor continued, pacing slowly. "It hasn't been easy. Blending two families is a challenge, especially when the cultural gap is so incredibly vast. I mean, I had to explain to Chloe's dear mother yesterday that one does not wear sensible shoes to a black tie fitting." More laughter. A few guests turned around in their chairs to crane their necks and look at Martha, who was now visibly trembling. "But we are a charitable family," Eleanor concluded, raising her glass. "To Preston and Chloe, may your marriage be as rich as the Kensington Trust Fund." The room erupted in applause. Chloe stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. She was going to scream. She was going to tear the microphone from Eleanor's manicured hands. But before she could take a step, she saw her father standing up in the back. Thomas Harper walked to the front. His limp was more pronounced tonight. The damp New England weather always made the old shrapnel wounds ache. He moved slowly, but there was an undeniable, commanding presence in his quiet demeanor. The room grew silent, the elite crowd watching him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Oh, he didn't ask for the microphone. He stood near the head table looking directly at Preston. "I don't have a trust fund," Thomas said, his voice deep, gravelly, and carrying across the quiet room without the need for amplification. "I don't have estates or yachts or corporate mergers. But I have a daughter who is kind, brilliant, and fiercely loyal. And a man who does not stand up to defend his future wife or her family is a man who possesses no true wealth at all." A shocking, breathless silence fell over the room. Preston's face flushed a deep, ugly red. Eleanor gasped, clutching her pearls in genuine, furious shock. "You are making a mistake, Chloe," Thomas said gently, turning to his daughter. "You don't have to do this." "Security!" Richard Kensington suddenly barked, his face purple with rage. "Get this pathetic old man away from the front." "Dad, no!" Chloe cried out as two burly club security guards stepped forward, grabbing Thomas by the arms. Thomas didn't fight them. He just looked at Chloe with a heartbreaking sadness as they forcefully escorted him back to the kitchen area. Preston grabbed Chloe's arm, his grip bruising. "Sit down!" he hissed, his charming facade entirely stripped away, revealing the cruel, entitled boy beneath. "He's embarrassing himself. Sit down and smile, or I swear to God, Chloe, I will cancel this whole thing and leave your family with the debt." Trapped, terrified for her parents' financial ruin, and entirely broken, Chloe sank back into her chair. The rehearsal dinner resumed, the wealthy guests returning to their oysters and champagne, entirely unfazed by the destruction of a family's dignity. The morning of the wedding dawned with a cruel, mocking brilliance. The sky over Newport, Rhode Island was a perfect cloudless azure, and the Atlantic Ocean glittered under the morning sun. Rosecliff Mansion stood as a breathtaking monument to excess, its white terracotta facade and sweeping heart-shaped staircase, looking like something pulled straight out of Versailles. Chloe sat in the master bridal suite, surrounded by a chaotic whirlwind of hairstylists, makeup artists, and frantic wedding coordinators holding clipboards. She felt entirely hollow. The reflection staring back at her in the gilded vanity mirror didn't look like a bride. It looked like a hostage. Down the hall, the indignities continued. Eleanor had explicitly barred Martha Harper from using the professional hair and makeup team. "They are incredibly expensive, Chloe," Eleanor had sneered earlier that morning sipping a mimosa. "And frankly, there is only so much magic these artists can perform. Your mother is better off doing it herself, in the public restroom downstairs. We need the suite for the women in the family who will actually be photographed." When Chloe had threatened to walk out, Eleanor had simply reminded her of the massive loans Thomas had taken out. "Walk away, my dear. But my husband's lawyers will ensure your parents' pathetic little house is seized by the bank before the end of the month to recoup our deposits. Put the dress on." At 1 p.m., an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, the Kensingtons and their VIP guests gathered on the grand front lawn for pre-wedding portraits. The women were dripping in diamonds. The men looked sharp in bespoke tuxedos. Thomas and Martha stood awkwardly near the edge of the driveway, watching from a distance. Martha had tried her best, wearing a navy blue dress she had found at a discount department store, but she looked exhausted and defeated. Thomas stood straight, holding his wife's hand, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. The photographer, a frantic man with a French accent, was arranging the Kensington family on the marble steps. "Okay, perfect. Now let us get the bride's parents in for a quick shot." "Bimo fotomao," the photographer called out, waving toward Thomas and Martha. Before Thomas could take a step forward, Richard Kensington stepped out of the frame, holding up a hand. "No, that won't be necessary," Richard said loudly, ensuring his wealthy friends gathered nearby could hear. "We're only doing the aesthetic shots right now. We don't want to ruin the symmetry of the album. They can take a Polaroid later." Preston laughed. A few of the groomsmen snickered. Chloe, standing frozen in her heavy gown on the top step, felt something inside her permanently snap. The fear of debt, the intimidation of the Kensington wealth, it all evaporated into a white-hot, blinding fury. She gathered handfuls of her massive silk skirt and began to march down the marble steps. She was going to end this. She was going to take her parents' walk down the driveway and never look back. But before her satin heel hit the bottom step, the heavy iron gates of the Rosecliff estate began to groan open. The security guard stationed at the entrance stepped back, looking bewildered. A low, powerful hum vibrated through the air, and then a motorcade breached the property. It wasn't just one car. It was 5 immaculate, midnight blue Rolls-Royce Phantoms flanked by 2 black SUVs with dark-tinted windows. The sheer imposing nature of the vehicles brought the entire lawn to a standstill. The string quartet, which had been playing softly on the terrace, faltered and stopped. Richard Kensington frowned, stepping forward, his corporate radar pinging. "Who is that?" Eleanor demanded, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Preston, did you order a motorcade?" "No," Preston said, looking confused. "Maybe it's the governor. Dad invited him." "The governor doesn't travel like that," Richard muttered, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the distinct gold-embossed crest painted on the door of the lead Rolls-Royce. His face suddenly went completely slack. "Good God, that's the royal crest of the Harrington estate." A murmur of shock rippled through the gathered elite. Even in their circles of extreme wealth, the Duke of Harrington, Edward Montague, was a mythical figure. He was one of the wealthiest aristocrats in Europe, a man whose private investment firm controlled hundreds of billions of dollars. Richard Kensington had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to secure a 5-minute meeting with the Duke's representatives to save his firm from a quiet, looming bankruptcy, and had been rejected every single time. The lead Rolls-Royce glided to a smooth halt precisely at the base of the marble steps, completely blocking the photographer's setup. The engines purred into silence. The heavy doors of the SUVs opened, and several imposing men in sharp suits with earpieces stepped out, scanning the crowd with cold, professional efficiency. Then, a driver in a pristine uniform stepped out of the lead Rolls-Royce and opened the rear passenger door. Out stepped Edward Montague, the Duke of Harrington. He was a tall, strikingly distinguished man in his late 50s, with silver hair at his temples and piercing, ice-blue eyes. He wore a masterfully tailored morning suit, carrying a silver-tipped walking stick that he seemed to hold more for style than necessity. His presence was so overwhelmingly authoritative that the entire lawn of millionaires and socialites seemed to physically shrink back. Richard Kensington practically shoved his wife aside, scrambling down the steps, his face instantly contorting into an obsequious, desperate smile. He hastily buttoned his tuxedo jacket and thrust his hand out. "Your Grace," Richard gasped, practically vibrating with excitement. I am Richard Kensington. What an absolute unimaginable honor. We had no idea you were in the States, let alone Newport. Please welcome to my son's wedding. Anything you need, our estate is at your disposal." Eleanor quickly flanked him, smoothing her hair, her eyes wide with greedy delight. "Your Grace, please come up the steps. We were just about to serve the vintage Dom Perignon." The Duke paused. He looked down at Richard Kensington's extended, desperate hand. He did not take it. Instead, the Duke's icy gaze swept slowly over Richard, then Eleanor, and finally settled on Preston. The look of profound aristocratic disgust on his face was so potent it made Richard physically lower his hand. "I am not here for you, Mr. Kensington," the Duke said. His voice was a rich, cultivated baritone with a sharp British clip cutting through the silence of the lawn like a whip. "In fact, I find the very air around your family quite difficult to stomach." Richard choked, his face draining of blood. Eleanor let out a strangled gasp. The Duke turned away from them entirely. He leaned his weight slightly on his silver-tipped cane and began to walk across the manicured grass. The crowd parted for him instinctively, moving out of his way as if he were a blazing fire. He didn't walk toward the mansion. He didn't walk toward the bar or the head table. He walked directly toward the edge of the driveway. He walked straight toward Thomas and Martha Harper. When the Duke stopped in front of Thomas, the entire estate was so silent that the crashing of the ocean waves suddenly sounded deafening. Thomas Harper looked at the Duke, his eyes widening slightly, a flicker of recognition passing through his weathered face. To the absolute horror and shock of the Kensington family and the hundreds of wealthy guests, watching Edward Montague, one of the most powerful men in the Western world, took off his expensive hat, bowed his head deeply, and then stepped forward, wrapping his arms around the poor limping mechanic in a fierce, emotional embrace. "It took me 25 years to find you, Tommy," the Duke whispered, his voice suddenly thick with unshed tears, loud enough for the paralyzed crowd to hear. "You saved my life in the desert, and I hear someone here has been disrespecting my brother." The silence that blanketed the sprawling lawn of Rosecliff Mansion was absolute, broken only by the distant crashing of the Atlantic waves against the Newport cliffs. The elite guests, a collection of Massachusetts senators, hedge fund managers, and old money aristocrats, stood entirely paralyzed. Champagne flutes hovered midway to mouths. Silk fans stopped fluttering. They were watching an impossible scene unfold. The Duke of Harrington, a man whose ancestral wealth and influence shaped global markets, was openly weeping as he held a poor, limping Rhode Island mechanic in his arms. Thomas Harper stood rigid for a moment, his calloused hands hovering in the air before he finally wrapped his arms around the Duke's tailored morning coat. Tears breached the corners of Thomas's weathered eyes, spilling down his cheeks. "Captain Montague." Thomas breathed, his voice thick with emotion and the weight of 25 years of silence. I didn't think you made it. They told me you didn't make it." The Duke pulled back, keeping his hands firmly clamped on Thomas's shoulders. He looked at the older man with a reverence usually reserved for deities. "I almost didn't, but I woke up in a military hospital in Landstuhl 3 weeks later. By the time I recovered enough to speak, your unit had been reassigned and your records were classified in the chaos of the withdrawal. I spent 2 decades employing the best private investigators in London to find the man who dragged me through 3 miles of burning sand. Richard Kensington, standing a few feet away, looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. Eleanor's heavily Botoxed face twitched in a desperate attempt to process the social hierarchy completely inverting before her eyes. "Your Grace," Richard interrupted, his voice trembling, stepping forward with a nervous, ingratiating laugh. "There must be some extraordinary misunderstanding. This man is Thomas Harper. He's just a baker's husband. A mechanic. He's my son's future father-in-law, yes, but—" The Duke turned his head. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by the glacial, unforgiving stare of a predator. "Do not speak to me," the Duke commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the terrifying weight of absolute authority. "Do not breathe in my direction unless I address you, Mr. Kensington." Richard flinched physically, stepping backward as if he had been slapped. The Duke turned back to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the sea of bewildered, wealthy faces. He raised his voice, ensuring every single person on the manicured lawn could hear him. "For those of you who are confused," the Duke announced, "allow me to educate you on the concept of true value. 25 years ago, during the Gulf War, I was a young, foolish captain attached to a British armored division. My convoy was ambushed behind enemy lines. We were decimated. I took shrapnel to the chest and was left bleeding out under the wreckage of a burning transport vehicle. The enemy was advancing. My own men were forced to fall back." The Duke gestured to Thomas, his voice swelling with fierce pride. "This man," the Duke continued, "was an American mechanic attached to a coalition recovery team. He had no obligation to be anywhere near the front line. He was under strict orders to retreat. Instead, under heavy mortar fire, Thomas Harper ran back into the kill zone. He pulled me from the wreckage. He was shot in the leg, a wound that causes the limp I see some of you arrogant fools smirking at today." The Duke's eyes locked onto Eleanor Kensington, who suddenly looked nauseous. "He carried me for 3 miles, the Duke said softly, the silence of the crowd hanging on his every word. "He dragged my bleeding body across the desert while his own blood filled his boots. He saved my life, sacrificing his own mobility, his own future for a foreign stranger. I went on to inherit a dukedom and a fortune. He went home to a quiet life, never asking for a medal, never asking for a reward." The Duke stepped past Thomas and approached Martha. The older woman was shaking, clutching her cheap navy purse to her chest. Edward Montague, the billionaire aristocrat, took Martha's rough, flour-dusted hand and bowed over it, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Mrs. Harper," he said gently, "you are married to the greatest man I have ever known. It is the honor of my lifetime to finally meet you." Martha let out a sob, covering her mouth. Chloe, standing paralyzed on the marble steps in her heavy wedding gown, felt a rush of overwhelming pride and heartbreak. Her father, the quiet man who fixed transmissions and baked bread, the man the Kensingtons had treated like a stray dog, was a hero of unimaginable proportions. "Now," the Duke said, turning his attention back to the Kensingtons, his silver-tipped cane striking the stone pathway with a sharp, lethal crack, "let us discuss the matter of how my savior's family has been treated by yours." The Duke gestured to one of the imposing men in dark suits who had stepped out of the black SUVs. The man immediately walked forward, opening a leather briefcase, and handed the Duke a thick, cream-colored manila folder. "When my security team finally located Thomas 2 weeks ago," the Duke explained, his tone shifting from emotional to ruthlessly corporate, "I naturally wanted to know everything about his life, to ensure I could offer him the gratitude he deserved. Imagine my surprise when I discovered his brilliant daughter was marrying into the Kensington family." Preston, who had been completely silent, finally stepped forward, his perfectly gelled hair looking suddenly less impressive against the sheer gravity of the situation. "Your Grace," Preston stammered, trying to employ his boardroom charm, "it's a beautiful coincidence. We love Chloe. We're welcoming her into our world." "Are you Preston?" "Oh." The Duke flipped open the folder. He didn't look at Preston. He looked directly at Richard Kensington, who was beginning to sweat profusely in his bespoke tuxedo. because my intelligence team painted a rather different picture of this welcome. The Duke pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder. It was a copy of an invoice. "Is this your handwriting?" Richard, the Duke asked, holding up the itemized bill the Kensingtons had forced upon Thomas. An invoice for $40,000. For administrative wedding fees and traditional familial obligations. "You extorted a retired mechanic to pay for the floral arrangements of your corporate networking event." Gasps erupted from the crowd, even among the ruthless elite. Shaking down the bride's working-class parents for party expenses was a vulgar, unforgivable breach of etiquette. The congressmen and the venture capitalists in the front row began murmuring to each other, shooting disgusted looks at Richard. It was a misunderstanding." Richard choked out, his face violently red. "A standard division of costs. You forced this man to take out a second mortgage on his modest home." The Duke snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating frequency. "A home he earned with honest labor while you sat in boardrooms, gambling with other people's pensions. You humiliated him. You seated him next to the kitchen doors at your rehearsal dinner. You barred his wife from utilizing the hairstylists this morning to save a few pennies." Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but the Duke silenced her with a single raised finger. "Do not embarrass yourself further, madam," he warned. He turned his attention back to Richard. "I know exactly why you wanted this lavish spectacle, Mr. Kensington. I know why you invited senators and investors instead of family. Because Kensington Rothschild Holdings is drowning." The collective gasp from the guests was deafening this time. Preston's head whipped toward his father, his eyes wide with shock. "Dad, what is he talking about?" "Oh, your son doesn't know." The Duke smiled, but it was a terrifying, humorless expression. "Mr. Kensington's private equity firm has been secretly insolvent for 6 months. 3 of his major real estate developments have gone belly up. He's over-leveraged by $150 million. This wedding was a smokescreen. A desperate display of fabricated wealth to convince your investors not to pull their capital." Richard looked as if he were going to vomit. The 2 venture capitalists, who had been seated at the head table the night before, immediately turned and began walking rapidly toward the valet stand, their phones already pressed to their ears. "You have spent the last 5 years begging my firm for a bailout meeting." The Duke continued, his voice cold and precise. "You called my offices 12 times last month alone, and now you stand before me having humiliated the man to whom I owe my very breath." Chloe finally found her voice. She walked down the remaining marble steps, the heavy silk of her $40,000 dress dragging on the stone. She didn't look at the Duke. She walked straight up to Preston. Preston looked panicked, his eyes darting frantically between his father's ruined face and Chloe. "Chloe, babe, listen to me," he whispered, reaching for her hands. "We can fix this. My dad's business doesn't matter. We're still getting married. The Duke is here. We can leverage this. Leverage this." Chloe repeated, the sheer revulsion in her voice startling even herself. "You're standing here watching my family be vindicated, watching your father's cruelty be exposed, and your first thought is how to leverage it. Chloe, be reasonable." "I have been reasonable," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying across the silent lawn. I have let you and your parents make me feel small. I let you treat my parents like dirt because I thought you loved me. But you don't love me, Preston. You loved having a quiet, compliant girl you could mold and a wedding you could use as a prop." Chloe reached up and grabbed the diamond engagement ring on her left hand. It was a massive, ostentatious stone that Eleanor had picked out. She yanked it off her finger. "The wedding is off," Chloe declared. She didn't throw the ring at him. She didn't give it to him at all. Instead, she turned and walked over to one of the catering tables set up on the lawn. She dropped the diamond ring directly into a silver bucket of melting ice. "Sell it," Chloe called out over her shoulder to Eleanor, who was clutching her chest as if experiencing a cardiac event. "It might help cover your bankruptcy lawyers." The crowd erupted into chaotic whispers. Preston stood frozen, his mouth open, entirely emasculated and stripped of his power. Richard Kensington sank onto one of the white folding chairs, putting his head in his hands as his empire crumbled around him in real time. The Duke of Harrington watched Chloe with an expression of profound approval. He turned to his assistant, who was still holding the briefcase. "Julian," the Duke said, Contact our financial division in New York. Have them buy the debt on Mr. Kensington's firm by close of business tomorrow. Then I want the firm liquidated. Sell it for parts. Make sure the Kensingtons are left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. Yes, Your Grace, the assistant said immediately, tapping on a tablet. And Julian, the Duke added, pay off the mortgage on the Harper's home immediately, in full, and set up a blind trust in Thomas Harper's name. Seed it with $10 million to start. We will discuss his actual compensation for saving a Duke's life later this evening. Thomas shook his head frantically. No, Captain. I don't want your money. I did what I had to do. I didn't do it for a payout. I know you didn't, Tommy, the Duke said softly, his harsh facade melting away as he looked at his old friend. That is precisely why you deserve it. You won't deny me the privilege of taking care of my brother, will you? Thomas looked at the Duke, then at Martha, who was weeping with overwhelming relief, and finally at Chloe, who was walking toward them free of the Kensington shadows. Thomas nodded slowly, swiping a rough hand across his wet eyes. Now, the Duke said, turning his back entirely on the Kensingtons and their ruined spectacle. He offered his arm to Martha. Mrs. Harper, I believe this estate has suddenly become rather polluted. My yacht, the Valerius, is docked at the Newport Marina. I have my personal chef aboard, and several bottles of wine that are far superior to the swill these frauds were about to serve. Would you do me the honor of joining me for a proper celebration? Martha, a woman who had spent 30 years baking bread at 4 a.m., looked at the billionaire Duke. She smiled a radiant, beautiful smile and looped her arm through his. I would love that, Edward, but only if you promise to let me bake you a proper pie someday. The Duke laughed, a booming, genuine sound that echoed across the lawn. It's a deal. Chloe walked up to her father. Thomas held out his hand, and she took it, gripping it tightly. He didn't look like a tired, poor mechanic anymore. As he stood tall, flanked by the Duke's security team, he looked like a king. Let's go home, Dad, Chloe whispered. Let's go, Thomas agreed. The Harpers and the Duke walked together toward the waiting motorcade. The Duke's driver held open the doors to the lead Rolls-Royce Phantom. Martha climbed in first, followed by Thomas. The Duke turned to Chloe, offering a respectful bow of his head before gesturing for her to enter. As Chloe gathered her dress to climb into the immaculate leather interior of the luxury car, she paused and looked back one last time. Rosecliff Mansion was in chaos. Guests were fleeing, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of Richard Kensington's exposed bankruptcy. Eleanor was screaming at the wedding planner about cancellation fees, while Preston stood alone on the grass, staring blankly at the ice bucket, where his future and his pride had been unceremoniously dumped. They looked small. For all their grand estates, their tailored clothes, and their cruel arrogance, they were the poorest people Chloe had ever met. The heavy door of the Rolls-Royce closed with a solid, satisfying thud. The engine purred to life, and the motorcade turned smoothly around the grand circular driveway. Inside the quiet, climate-controlled cabin, the Duke popped the cork on a bottle of incredibly rare champagne. He poured a glass for Thomas, one for Martha, and handed the crystal flute to Chloe. To narrow escapes, the Duke toasted, raising his glass. And to the unbreakable bond of good people. Thomas clinked his glass against the Duke's. Two good people. As the fleet of Rolls-Royces glided out of the iron gates of Rosecliff, leaving the Kensingtons to their self-inflicted ruin, Chloe took a sip of the champagne. It was cold, crisp, and tasted exactly like freedom. She looked at her parents, their faces glowing with a peace they hadn't known in months, and she knew she had never been richer. The Rolls-Royce motorcade wove through the historic, sun-drenched streets of Newport, Rhode Island, leaving the sprawling nightmare of Rosecliff Mansion far behind. Inside the lead Phantom, the silence was no longer heavy with anxiety, but floating on the effervescent high of profound relief. Chloe leaned her head against the cool leather of the window, watching the Atlantic coastline blur past. The $40,000 silk wedding gown, which had felt like a suffocating shroud just an hour ago now, felt like nothing more than a ridiculous Halloween costume she was about to take off. When the motorcade arrived at the private docks of the Newport Marina, the true scale of the Duke of Harrington's resources became undeniably clear. Docked at the end of the longest pier was the Valerius, an 85-meter superyacht that looked less like a boat and more like a floating modernist palace of tinted glass and pristine white steel. The Duke's staff, dressed in immaculate white uniforms, lined the boarding ramp. They did not look at Thomas's worn suit or Martha's discount department store dress with the disdain the Kensingtons had. They bowed their heads with genuine trained respect as the Duke escorted his guests aboard. "Welcome to my humble dinghy, Thomas," Edward Montague said, his eyes crinkling at the corners with a warmth that was entirely absent when he had addressed Richard Kensington. Thomas let out a low whistle, his mechanic's eyes immediately scanning the incredible engineering of the vessel. "Humble," he says, "Captain, this thing has more horsepower in its auxiliary generators than my entire garage combined. And she's entirely at your disposal," the Duke replied, clapping a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "But first, I believe Mrs. Harper was promised a proper meal." The afternoon bled into evening on the aft deck of the Valerius. Chloe changed out of her heavy wedding dress into a simple, elegant linen sundress borrowed from the yacht's guest wardrobe. For the first time in 18 months, she felt like she could actually breathe. Dinner was prepared by Arturo, the Duke's personal Michelin-starred chef, but it was served entirely without the stiff, suffocating pretension of the Beacon Hill Club. They ate family-style off exquisite Limoges porcelain platters of perfectly seared sea scallops, wild mushroom risotto shaved with white truffles, and a rustic heirloom tomato salad that Arturo insisted he had flown in from his brother's farm in Tuscany just that morning. As they ate, the two men talked. Chloe and Martha sat quietly captivated as Thomas and Edward peeled back the layers of 25 years. They didn't speak of the wealth or the dukedom. They spoke of the unforgiving heat of the desert, the suffocating smell of burning diesel, and the names of the young men in their unit who had never made it home to see the turn of the millennium. "When the mortar hit your transport," Thomas said softly, tracing the rim of his crystal wine glass, "Command radio to total retreat, said the sector was lost, but I saw the smokestack from your rig. I couldn't leave a man burning. I just couldn't." The Duke looked down at his hands, twisting a heavy gold signet ring on his finger. "I remember waking up being dragged. The pain was blinding. I kept telling you to leave me, that the enemy infantry was closing in. And you—" The Duke looked up, a wet, incredulous laugh escaping his lips. "You cursed at me. You called me a stubborn, posh idiot and told me that if I died on you, you'd kill me yourself." Martha laughed, wiping a tear from her cheek. "That sounds exactly like my Thomas. He saved my life, Martha." The Duke said, his voice dropping to a fierce, solemn whisper. "I have built an empire across 3 continents. I have dined with prime ministers and royalty. But every breath I have taken since 1991 belongs to the man sitting across from me." When my investigators finally found his name on a declassified coalition manifest 2 weeks ago, I dropped everything. I came to America to give him the world. Instead, I found a family of corporate vultures trying to pick his bones clean. The Duke turned his piercing ice blue gaze to Chloe. "And what about you, Chloe? My dossiers are quite thorough, but I prefer to hear it from the source. You studied at the Rhode Island School of Design, Art Restoration, yes?" Chloe blinked, surprised. "Yes, Your Grace. Edward, please," he interrupted gently. "Any child of Thomas's is family to me." "Edward," Chloe corrected, a shy smile touching her lips. "Yes, I specialize in 19th century maritime oils and canvas repair. I was working at a gallery in Boston when I met Preston. He convinced me to leave the gallery. He said the hours were too long, that it didn't fit with the social schedule his family required. He promised to set up a private studio for me after the wedding, but..." She trailed off the reality of Preston's endless lies, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. Edward's jaw tightened. A classic tactic of an insecure man: isolate the partner, kill their passion, and make them entirely dependent on the fabricated world he controls. You have a gift, Chloe, to take something broken, something damaged by time and neglect, and restore it to its original beauty. That is a rare and precious skill. The Duke raised his glass of vintage Bordeaux. To broken things, he said softly, and to the strength it takes to make them whole again. Monday morning hit the Kensington family not with a sunrise, but with the ruthless mechanical precision of an executioner's axe. At exactly 9 a.m., the glass doors of Kensington Rothschild Holdings in downtown Boston swung open. A team of 12 corporate attorneys, flanked by forensic accountants and led by the Duke of Harrington's chief American legal counsel, strode into the high-rise lobby. They completely bypassed the receptionist, ignoring her panicked protests, and walked directly into the glass-walled executive boardroom, where Richard Kensington was desperately trying to conduct an emergency crisis meeting with his remaining partners. Richard looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his custom suit looking rumpled and slept in. The weekend had been a catastrophic free fall of canceled contracts and frantic, unanswered phone calls to investors who had fled Rosecliff. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, though his voice cracked with undisguised terror. The lead attorney, a man named Arthur Sterling, dropped a stack of heavy-bound legal documents directly onto the center of the mahogany conference table. The thud sounded like a gavel. "Good morning, Mr. Kensington," Arthur said coldly. "As of 8 a.m. this morning, the Harrington estate and its subsidiary investment arms have successfully purchased the entirety of your firm's outstanding debt from your primary lenders. All $150 million of it." Richard's face drained of color, turning a sickly, translucent gray. You bought the debt. Then we can renegotiate. We can set up a payment structure." "There will be no renegotiation," Arthur interrupted, leaning forward, resting his knuckles on the table. "As the new primary debt holder, we are calling the loans in immediately. You have violated a dozen financial covenants over the last 3 fiscal quarters. Your assets are frozen pending a full forensic audit. The SEC has already been notified of the discrepancies in your real estate portfolios." "You're liquidating us," one of Richard's partners whispered, horror dawn over his face. "You're bankrupting the firm." "No," Arthur corrected, a razor-thin smile appearing on his face. "The Duke is bankrupting you. The Harrington estate has explicitly instructed us to sell this firm for parts. By Friday, Kensington Rothschild will not exist. Furthermore, personal guarantees were signed on these loans. Mr. Kensington, I suggest you call your wife. The bank will be foreclosing on the Lexington estate by the end of the week." While Richard was collapsing into a leather executive chair, clutching his chest as his empire evaporated, Eleanor Kensington was experiencing her own spectacular fall from grace at the exclusive Lexington Country Club. She had shown up for her 10 a.m. tennis match, desperately trying to project an aura of normalcy, trying to pretend the disaster at the wedding was simply a misunderstanding. But as she approached the clubhouse, the club manager stepped onto the terrace, blocking her path. "Eleanor, tapotwap bus for tough." The manager said, his tone devoid of the usual fawning deference. "I'm afraid your membership card has been declined at the gates. We've received notice from your banking institution that your accounts have been frozen. And quite frankly, after the display in Newport this weekend, the board feels it's best if you collect your things from your locker and do not return." Eleanor stared at him, her manicured hands shaking violently. Women she had played tennis with for a decade were suddenly deeply fascinated by their water bottles refusing to make eye contact with her. The social exile was absolute, instantaneous, and brutal. But perhaps the most pathetic display of the Kensington downfall belonged to Preston. On Tuesday afternoon, a heavy rain washed over the blue-collar neighborhoods of Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Chloe was sitting at the kitchen table of her parents' modest home, sipping chamomile tea and laughing with her mother as they watched a cooking show. The crushing weight of the wedding debt was gone. The Duke's financial team had wired the mortgage payoff to the bank on Monday morning, freeing Thomas from the $40,000 snare. A frantic, Heavy knocking at the front door shattered the peaceful afternoon. Chloe stood up, walking down the narrow hallway. She peered through the peephole and felt a surge of pure, unadulterated disgust. She opened the door. Preston stood on the small concrete porch, completely soaked by the rain. He wasn't wearing a Tom Ford suit. He was wearing a rumpled polo shirt and khakis, and he was holding a pathetic, plastic-wrapped bouquet of gas station roses. Behind him, parked illegally on the curb, was a yellow taxi cab. His leased Porsche 911 had been repossessed the night before. Chloe. Preston breathed, looking at her with wide, desperate eyes. Thank God! I've been calling your phone for 3 days. I blocked your number. Preston, Chloe said, her voice deadpan, crossing her arms over her chest. What are you doing here? Please just let me in, he begged, shivering in the rain. Chloe, it's a nightmare. My dad's firm is gone. They seized the house, my trust fund. It's completely gone. They took everything. I know, Chloe said simply. I read the Wall Street Journal this morning. Preston stepped forward, reaching out a hand, but Chloe stepped back, her eyes flashing with a dangerous warning. He dropped his hand, swallowing hard. I was wrong. I was so wrong. But Chloe, we love each other. The wedding, we can still get married. We can go to a courthouse. We can start over your family. The Duke gave your dad $10 million, Chloe. You guys have the capital now. We can rebuild. I can help your dad manage the trust. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the damp air. What the hey? Chloe actually laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound that cut through the sound of the rain. You really don't hear yourself, do you? Chloe asked, shaking her head. You don't want me, Preston. You want my father's money. The same money your family laughed at him for not having 3 days ago. No, Chloe, please, I love you. You loved a prop, Chloe corrected, her voice hardening into steel. You loved a girl you could control. When my parents were poor, you let your mother treat them like trash. You sat there and let your father force my disabled dad to take out a second mortgage to pay for your caviar. And you didn't say a single word to defend us. I was under my father's thumb. I didn't have a choice. Preston pleaded, tears of genuine panic mixing with the rain on his face. My father ran into a burning kill zone with a bullet in his leg because it was the right thing to do. Chloe said, her voice ringing with fierce, unbreakable pride. He didn't have a choice either. He just had character, something you and your entire family are utterly bankrupt of. Preston opened his mouth to argue, but Chloe stepped forward, closing the distance, her eyes boring into his. Go away, Preston. Go find a job. Go learn what it actually feels like to work for a living. If you ever come near this house or my family again, I will make a single phone call to Edward Montague, and I promise you, you won't even be able to get a job flipping burgers in this state. Are we clear? Preston shrank back, the last remnants of his arrogant facade crumbling into dust. He looked at the cheap flowers in his hand, then at the fierce, beautiful woman he had entirely underestimated. He turned, his shoulders slumped, and walked back out into the pouring rain toward the waiting taxi. Chloe shut the door, locked the deadbolt, and walked back into the kitchen. Who was that sweetie? Martha asked, looking up from the television. Just a door-to-door salesman, Mom. Chloe smiled, pouring herself another cup of tea. Nobody important. 14 months later, the air in Boston's historic South End smelled sharply of Dammer varnish, aged linseed oil, and the sweet, comforting aroma of freshly baked sourdough bread. The grand opening of Harper and Montague Fine Arts Restorations was the most anticipated cultural event of the autumn season. Chloe stood in the center of the expansive loft-style gallery, her hands dusted lightly with white chalk, looking around at the magnificent space that was finally hers. The Duke had not just given Thomas a blind trust, he had become a relentless, supportive, silent partner for Chloe. He had purchased the historic brick building outright, outfitting it with state-of-the-art ventilation systems, chemical fume hoods, and specialized lighting required for museum-grade art restoration. You have a gift, Edward had told her on the yacht, and he had ensured the world would finally see it. The front half of the building served as a gallery, displaying 19th century pieces Chloe had painstakingly brought back to life. But the true masterpiece of the evening was located in the adjoining storefront, connected by an open archway. Martha Harper had finally gotten her dream. The Duke's financial team had easily secured the commercial permits, and Harbor Crust Bakery was now a thriving, beautiful reality. The space featured gleaming marble countertops, imported French ovens, and a massive display case filled with Martha's legendary cinnamon rolls, artisanal breads, and delicate pastries. The grand opening was a vibrant, joyous affair. There were no venture capitalists, no corrupt senators, and no socialites sizing up each other's diamond necklaces. The room was filled with artists, local business owners from Pawtucket Museum, curators and friends who had known the Harpers for decades. Thomas stood near the bakery counter, laughing loudly with a group of local mechanics he used to work with. The limp that had plagued him for 25 years was noticeably absent. The Duke had flown in the top orthopedic surgical team from Geneva 6 months prior, entirely reconstructing the damaged tissue in Thomas's leg. For the first time since 1991, Thomas Harper was walking completely pain-free. The brass bell above the front door chimed, and a hush naturally fell over the front of the gallery. Edward Montague, the Duke of Harrington, stepped inside. He was dressed impeccably as always in a bespoke charcoal suit, though he had forgone the silver-tipped walking stick tonight. He was flanked by 2 discreet security guards, but his demeanor was entirely relaxed, his ice-blue eyes scanning the room with genuine delight. Chloe walked over, beaming, and threw her arms around the Duke. He hugged her back fiercely, entirely unbothered by the chalk dust she transferred to his expensive lapel. "Edward, you made it." Chloe smiled, stepping back. "Wild horses, the British Parliament, and a hurricane couldn't have kept me away." "Chloe," the Duke smiled, looking up at the high ceilings and the magnificent artwork displayed under the gallery lights. "This is extraordinary. You have built an absolute sanctuary." "We built it," Chloe corrected softly. "Thank you for everything." "Nonsense. I simply provided the canvas. You provided the color," Edward replied before taking a deep breath, his eyes widening. Now tell me that smell is your mother's famous blackberry tart, because I explicitly skipped lunch in London today just to save room. She baked 2 just for you. Come on." Chloe laughed, leading him through the archway toward the bakery. As the Duke approached, Thomas turned around. The 2 men embraced, not as a billionaire and a mechanic, but as brothers forged in a fire that only they understood. "Look at you, Tommy," the Duke grinned, gesturing to Thomas's steady stance. "Standing taller than a royal guard." "I feel like I'm 20 again, Captain." Thomas beamed, clapping Edward on the shoulder. "Martha's got your tarts in the back, but first there's something Chloe wants to show you." Chloe led Edward back into the main gallery, guiding him toward the back wall where a large canvas was covered by a velvet drape. The crowd naturally parted, forming a quiet semicircle around them. "When you told my father that you wanted to invest in my studio," Chloe said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet room, "I wanted my first personal restoration project to be something that mattered, something that represented what this last year has meant to our family." Chloe reached out and pulled the velvet drape away. It was not a 19th century maritime oil. It was a photograph, but it had been masterfully enlarged, restored, and transferred onto a grand canvas using a delicate emulsion process. The image was grainy, black and white, and deeply powerful. It was a photograph taken by a coalition journalist in 1991, dug out of the British Ministry of Defense archives by Chloe over months of relentless searching. It showed a heavily damaged medical evacuation helicopter kicking up a massive cloud of desert sand, and in the foreground, struggling toward the chopper, was a young, grime-covered American mechanic. His own leg was visibly bleeding, his uniform torn to shreds, but his arms were locked fiercely under the shoulders of an unconscious British captain, dragging him out of the burning hellscape and into the light. Underneath the canvas, A small brass plaque read, "True Wealth Restored." Edward Montague stared at the image. The billionaire Duke, a man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated with world leaders without a flinch, brought a trembling hand to his mouth. The tears that filled his eyes were immediate and overwhelming. He didn't speak for a long time. The gallery was so silent you could hear the soft humming of the bakery ovens next door. Finally, Edward turned. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Thomas, who was wiping his own eyes, standing beside Martha, whose arm was wrapped tightly around his waist. They say that history forgets the quiet heroes. The Duke whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But I will ensure that as long as I have breath in my lungs, the world will remember the name Thomas Harper. Edward turned to Chloe, pulling her into another tight embrace. It is a masterpiece, Chloe. The greatest thing I have ever seen. The room erupted into applause. Someone popped a bottle of champagne in the back, the joyous sound echoing off the brick walls. Chloe stood between her father and the Duke, looking out at the room filled with love, laughter, and genuine warmth. She thought briefly, fleetingly, of Rosecliff Mansion. She thought of Eleanor's cruel sneer, Richard's desperate greed, and Preston's hollow promises. They had possessed all the money in the world, yet they lived in a terrifying, fragile house of cards, terrified of anyone discovering how empty they truly were. Chloe looked at her father's smiling face, and then at the magnificent restoration on the wall behind them. She finally understood what the Duke had meant on the yacht that first night. True wealth wasn't something you could lock in a vault display on a manicured lawn or wear on your finger. True wealth was loyalty. It was the willingness to walk into the fire for someone else. It was the courage to take something broken and patiently, lovingly put it back together. And as the music swelled and the champagne flowed, surrounded by the smell of oil paint and fresh bread, Chloe Harper knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she was the richest woman in the world. Did that twist give you chills? Family is about so much more than money, and karma always collects its debts in the most spectacular ways. The Kensingtons thought they could buy class, but they learned the hard way that true honor, the kind Thomas Harper showed in the desert, is absolutely priceless. If you loved seeing those arrogant snobs finally get exactly what they deserved, smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that the universe always balances the scales. And make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our daily dose of drama and sweet revenge. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done if you were Chloe? See you in the next one.